Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and good to see everyone again this evening. At the end of our last meeting, we left off with a motion that I had put forward regarding the disclosure of some documents related to emergency response assistance plans and key route risk assessments. Both of these, the assessment and these plans are required by Transport Canada, and they are written and compiled by the shippers of dangerous goods and by the railway companies. And the scope of this study that we've undertaken is whether communities have adequate capacity to protect their safety, and whether the emergency response plans that are in place and which are required by Transport Canada are up to the task of saving human lives and preventing the destruction of our communities in the case of rail disasters. I don't think that we can get very far in this study without seeing the contents of the existing response plans, without seeing the risk assessments, without better understanding what those risks are, and without understanding the level of detail and the scrutiny that Transport Canada requires of these companies that operate in this space. I have had some conversations offline with members of the government who have expressed concerns about the sensitivity of some of the information contained in those response plans. And by no means do I want to put our communities or our country at any level of additional risk through the disclosure of documents. I want to make that very clear. If there's information in those response plans that could jeopardize or expose our communities to additional risk, that's certainly not my intention. However, we do have the ability as a committee to seek documents and to hold those in confidence and to use the contents of those documents to inform our work and the scope of our inquiry. And that's very much the intention of my motion. I did craft the motion on the fly at the last meeting, and sometimes, if you sleep on it for a few nights, you come up with some other ideas about how it might better serve its purpose. So I'd like to offer, and I know I can't amend my own motion, but I'd like to offer a revised version that perhaps addresses some of the concerns that we've heard from the government. So the new motion text that I would certainly be comfortable with would read that Transport Canada provide to the committee by January 15th, 2025, the unredacted emergency response assistance plans and key route risk assessments applicable to the following rail routes: Prince George, Prince Rupert, Fraser Canyon, Montreal-Sorel, Toronto, Windsor. That the documents in question be provided in both official languages and considered at an in-camera meeting of the committee to take place before February 15th, 2025, and that the documents be kept confidential by the committee and committee members. It's been expressed to me by some of my colleagues that I don't know what's in these plans and that what's in them isn't actually what I want to see in the first place, and that I should just keep my nose out of it. That may very well be the case. I think the best way to find out is by seeing the documents. Maybe these documents aren't relevant to our line of inquiry, but they remain some of the key plans that protect our communities. And I did take the chance over the past couple of days since our last meeting to go on Transport Canada's website and learn more about specifically emergency response assistance plans. And the website lays out in great detail what is required of those plans. And I'll just read for the committee's edification a few of the requirements. It includes creating the potential incident analysis, or PIA. Companies' PIAs, potential incident analyses, must include at a minimum the following 4 scenarios. Scenario 1, an anticipated release of dangerous goods. For example, a tanker containing hydrochloric acid involved in a rollover with no apparent loss of contents. Scenario 2, the release of less than 1% of the dangerous goods in a means of containment. For example, a full DOT 105 J500W rail car inspected in a rail yard is giving off an odor of chlorine at the protective housing. Scenario 3, the release of more than 50% of the dangerous goods in a means of containment. For example, multiple immediate bulk containers were punctured and are leaking in a road trailer that has been involved in a motor vehicle collision. Scenario 4, and again, that doesn't pertain specifically to rail. These ERAPs apply across the entire dangerous goods environment. The ones that we're looking for pertain specifically to rail transport. And scenario 4, the exposure to fire of a means of containment that contains dangerous goods. And I think that one in particular is of interest when we're talking about protecting our communities from industrial fires related to dangerous goods shipped by rail. What to include for each scenario. So for each scenario, the companies that ship these products are required to explain the possible consequences of the release or anticipated release, the measures organized by tier to be taken in response to the release or anticipated release for each scenario, the persons responsible for taking the measures, in addition to the persons who will respond on their behalf. It should include persons responsible for taking measures not identified in the ERAP. For example, the companies may identify municipal first responders in the PIA. So we go on. ERAP response equipment. They have to list the availability of equipment, the type and amount of equipment that will be brought to bear on a dangerous goods emergency. The availability of equipment, whether the company owns and maintains the equipment itself, identified suppliers where response equipment can be procured and delivered to the site. It says, plan for the worst. Certain incident scenarios may require more equipment than could be expected or planned for. If you own, maintain, and replenish the equipment yourself, mention alternative third parties in the ERAP, such as other responders or suppliers that could provide additional equipment. It goes on, Mr. Chair. And I don't want to belabor this point, but if you go further on, it talks about fire response knowledge and skills, and companies are required to lay out the knowledge and skills of their teams. It also requires them to list the location of those teams. There are response times that are required. They have to list deployment. If they plan to deploy personnel by air to meet response times, there are all sorts of criteria around the deployment of teams by air. This is a serious consideration for the communities I represent because, to my knowledge, the nearest team is up to 4 hours away from the communities they would be responding to. These are the specialized hazmat teams that would be required. So that leaves the local volunteer fire department as the front line of defense. When it comes to municipal fire departments and other first responders, there's a whole section of these ERAPs that talks about third-party responders. And the companies are required to list which responders they have agreements with and what capacity those responders have. So this is a comprehensive emergency response plan. I had a conversation with a local fire chief yesterday, and he described a scenario involving a road accident where a tank truck had crashed and there was a release of a dangerous good. And his department responded and very valiantly and were able to mitigate the situation and to stop the release of the dangerous goods. The emergency response assistance plan, you end up in a situation where you have the transportation company and you have the shipper of the dangerous goods. And they end up, in some cases, fighting over liability for the situation. It took 2 days before the responsible party was able to visit the scene and carry out their obligations. So these are the things that we need to find out as a committee, whether these emergency response assistance plans are adequate, whether they're sufficient to protect our communities, whether the resources that are included in these plans are close enough to get there quickly. We heard testimony, I think fairly alarming testimony at our last meeting from Transport Canada about some of these high consequence scenarios. And they read into the record the very short amount of time that first responders have to evacuate people in the case of a serious hazmat event in a rail yard. 9 minutes, an evacuation radius of 1.7 kilometers. When we're talking about specialized teams that are up to 4 hours away by road and having to get there in inclement winter weather, I think there are some very serious questions that people in our communities should be asking about whether these plans are sufficient. It may be that when we see the plans, they're much more detailed and much more effective than we think they are, than I think they are. In which case, I would find that very comforting. But I think the only way to know that is to see the plans. We want to protect any sensitive information that might be in the plans, and that's why the amended version of the motion, I believe, achieves that by bringing it to an in-camera meeting of the committee and holding it in confidence. If we look at this information and decide that it is in the public interest for it to be released publicly, we can choose to do that either in whole or in part. But our responsibility as a committee, on behalf of Canadians, on behalf of these communities that we represent, is to ensure that we get to the bottom of this question about whether the government is carrying out its fundamental responsibility to keep them safe and to regulate a sector that is carrying dangerous goods through the heart of our towns and our villages. So I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair. I hope my colleagues will agree to dispense of this in short order so that we can hear from our excellent witnesses that are here today. I certainly want to hear from them. I know I went on at some length. I see Mr. Badaway laughing. But this is really serious stuff. And I think we need to see the documents. Thank you. I'm struck by those last comments and also by the fact that the improvements that we've seen, so many of them, like Directive 36, are written in the blood of people who have lost their lives in disasters. And I think what we're trying to do here at this committee through this study is to look down the road and try to strengthen the protective system without it costing the lives of our neighbors. And so, you know, thinking about what we've heard around these plans and preparedness, and I'm struck by Chief Case's words about Canada's geography and the difficulty of applying a standard response across Canada. And that hits home because the part of Canada that I represent is a region of rural and remote communities. And yet the same volumes of goods go through our communities as go through downtown Edmonton. And so it seems that the risk is dictated by the products and the capacity for response is dictated by the tax base. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges, the unique challenges that small rural fire departments face when dealing with the volumes of hazardous goods that we're talking about moving through our towns?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. Between you and Mayor Lassard, you've hit most of the issues that we would talk about. If you're talking about your own area, it's a volunteer area. They, as you've seen from our census that we referred to, 56% of our reported fire departments are struggling to maintain basic equipment for firefighting. Being able, because of the increase in the cost of fire trucks, which have gone up massively over the past 2 years, the cost of training, the cost of PPE, some of our fire chiefs are struggling to maintain a basic firefighting provision. What we're talking about now is a highly technical hazardous materials response to a really complex incident that would challenge any fire chief. So when it comes to the risks, you're quite correct. We've talked a lot about the preparation and about the strengthening of rail cars and to try and prevent the incident from happening, but we're also now talking about when the unknown happens. And our business is the unforeseeable. We're the people that get called when there's an unforeseeable incident. And it's really difficult to maintain that level of response across such a wide area. But it would also be very difficult for your local municipality to fund the level of response that might be needed to deal with this catastrophic incident.
I wanted to ask about the cost of providing capacity. As a former mayor, I know that small municipalities are stretched when it comes to their resources. Small fire departments are stretched, as you've just mentioned. And yet the companies shipping goods through our communities, many of them have, you know, millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue. And the costs don't seem equitably distributed. Should the costs of responding to major industrial spills and fires along the rail line be borne by municipal property taxpayers? Is it fair?
Through you, Mr. Chair. If we had a chemical factory built in your area, the E2 regulations and the rest of the federal regulations would demand that that plant not only is safe to operate, but has mitigation plans should there be a leak within that plant. It's not fair because you've now got that risk that travels at speed through different areas. And I'll also concede to Mr. Matheson, it's incredibly difficult to have a response that can follow that risk. But you are quite correct. In a lot of the areas where these trucks are going through, the first responders will not be equipped. They won't be trained. And it's very difficult. We're seeing recruitment of volunteer firefighters become harder and harder because of the changes in people's lives and the way that they work. We're also seeing that in some provinces, there's you have to be licensed as a firefighter the same way that a full-time firefighter is. So the costs are not going down, and the level of technical response needed for an incident like this would be extreme.
So, given all of that, how do we protect residents in small communities? I'm thinking about my community of Smithers. You know, it's named after the chairman of the railroad. It's a railroad town. There are hundreds of people who live right along the rail line, who live and work in close proximity to those trains that are coming through. Given the challenges around capacity, how do we protect their lives?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Overall, there's got to be prevention rather than response. So the work that is taking place to improve safety, that has got to be the way to deal with this. But there has to be an acknowledgement that not only a risk to life, but also a risk to the community and also a risk to the environment. There has to be investment that at least that stopgap that's put in place until the industry experts show up can be effective. So I realise I'm not answering your question because it's a very difficult one to answer. But
some of the most difficult scenarios to talk about are these worst-case scenarios that are extremely high consequence. And so if we're talking about multiple rail cars on fire in the heart of a community, which we've seen, at risk of BLEVE, these boiling liquid evaporating vapor explosions, is it reasonable to expect there to be a response that prevents the loss of human life? Like, as a resident, I would sure hope that it is. But when you look at the hard facts, when you look at the time required to evacuate, you look at the number of people that would need to be evacuated, you look at the capacity of the community, it really stretches the imagination to understand how a small fire department would get people out of the way.
I'll let you respond, Chief Case.
thank you, Mr. Chair. With the hazardous materials incident, the incident commander has got two very definite options. Move the people away from the bad stuff or move the bad stuff away from the people. So at the very least, there's got to be a response where you can do a meaningful evacuation. That is training and awareness and community education so that people are aware that this stuff is coming through the municipality. And the evacuation plan. You basically, and again, I'm speaking from a professional perspective, you're seeking an element of self-evacuation to effectively get people away from this. Whether a crew can arrive and immediately mitigate a BLEVE or something like that, that is nearly impossible at times. You really do have to put as much water on it as you can and get everybody away for up to 24 hours.
Chief Casey, you described situations in which it's just not going to be possible for local fire departments to attack a fire, to get in there and respond directly, and that there's a need to get people out. There's a need for people to self-evacuate. It would seem to me that this is made harder by the emergency response distance that's recommended, 450 meters. Now, I talked to a local fire chief who spoke of the challenge that presents for firefighters because the people in that radius are their neighbors. And it's going to be very difficult to hold them back when they know people that work in those buildings right next to the railroad. What is the best practice for alerting people and quickly evacuating them from situations where first responders can't get close enough to knock on their door?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. It's very difficult to pin down a best practice because, again, this comes down to geography and other such things. Alerting people can be done through, we've used reverse 911 systems, we've used systems of alerting through mobile phones. We can actually do the federal alert and the provincial alert, which alerts everybody's phones. But again, that all takes time. And in my experience, the most effective way of evacuating people is where someone has to knock on the door and basically say, you need to leave. You know, people will see something on their phone. And when they get that trusted face at the door, then, and I've seen firefighters and police officers pleading with people to leave their homes. We can't force anybody to leave their homes. So in terms of best practice, that would really be an interesting point from a federal perspective about what would be the best way to do this over a wider area. But I accept your chief's point. Some of the evacuation distances listed in the ERG are flabbergasting. I mean, we're talking kilometres, you know, especially at night when people are asleep, and it is significantly a challenge.
Could I fit in one quick question to Mayor Lessard?
Depends
I
how
know
good
you've
you are.
been
You have
very
40
patient
seconds,
with
sir.
me. How many seconds?
40 seconds.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, I wonder if I could ask you, based on what you know about your community and what you've heard at these hearings, whether you feel your residents are adequately protected from major incidents involving dangerous goods.
La réponse est non.
My answer is no. They are not well protected.
I want to thank all of our witnesses. This has been really excellent testimony. Mr. Case, your recommendation around a national fire administration is one that we'll certainly take to heart. I can pledge to you that I'll do my part in trying to ensure that it's among the recommendations in this report. I did want to go back to community preparedness and this wide variation that we see among communities of different sizes. In my region, local fire departments are offered training by the shippers several times per year, once per year. I'm not sure the frequency. I've had a chance to observe some of that training, and I think it's certainly better than nothing. The question is around whether there should be national standards for community preparedness and capacity. I don't think that many residents of our small communities understand the limitations of first responders. Like our fire departments, our first responders do incredible work, and they do incredible work within serious limitations. The question is whether there should be some thought put to establishing a standard for communities to respond to dangerous goods incidents. Or whether the current patchwork of volunteer training opportunities is adequate to really protect lives. We've had the conversation about how the costs should be distributed. I think they have to be distributed fairly. That's a clear point. But when it comes to having adequate and sufficient response capacity, having the capability, having enough water, having enough materials, having enough trained people, should there be some sort of standardization across the country so communities know that they are adequately protected?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. We've talked a lot about leadership, and we see differences between the different provinces. I'll give you one brief example. When we talk about incident command, it's an incident command system. In some provinces, emergency management is an incident management system, which sounds like a difference in language, but it's a difference in approach. So when we talk about the National Fire Administrator and when we talk about the lessons learned from Megontic, leadership is what's needed right now. And I think to have any kind of leadership at the federal level, which comes down to a community, is going to be significant. And I'll draw your attention again to the E2 regulations, where large producers of dangerous goods have to consider the community, they have to consider their emergency response plans, they have to consider what they do with us as responders. And that might very well be a model. But I appreciate the questions.
Thank you very much.